The announcement of the indictment of 12 Russian intelligence officials by the United States through the work of Bob Mueller is something we ought to take personally in Illinois. You see, of the 20 states that were compromised, the integrity of their election system compromised, Illinois was the first to publicly announce. We knew it happened and we said it to the world. It was later confirmed in other states and other places. What happened, unfortunately, was we left a little wormhole in a computer program that allowed the Russians to get into the official voter list of the state of Illinois. They could have literally compromised all of our election results, and they could have changed the outcome of the election. It didn't reach that point, as far as we know, but they had the power to do that. So the question now is what lies ahead, and we have conflicting reports from the Trump administration. Last Friday, the head of the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, my former Republican colleague in the Senate from Indiana, said that they fully anticipated that the Russians were going to try to do it again in this election this year. And then Secretary Nielsen of the Department of Homeland Security contradicted that the next day, saying there's no concern on her part about such Russian infiltration. I think she is painfully naive, as she has been on so many other topics. I believe the Russians will use everything to their advantage to try to undermine the United States, the integrity of our democracy, and the participation of all of us in the most important part of that democracy, the election. So I hope that the Trump administration will take Director Coats seriously and ignore Secretary Nielsen. We need to put resources in place so that every election system across the United States can defend itself, so that we have a paper record of votes, as we do here in Springfield, many other places, a paper record to verify against the final results if there are any questions raised. I don't doubt that Putin is on the warpath when it comes to the United States. He has been for a long time. And this meeting between him and President Trump gives me no confidence that things are going to change. In fact, I joined with others in saying that the meeting should be at least postponed until it's clear the president is going to confront Putin at the outset with this clear evidence that we have that led to these indictments. So far, the president has not even acknowledged the problem, let alone shown a dedication to solving it. Second issue, which I wanted to speak to today, is the announcement of the Trump administration of a new nominee to fill the vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh is someone that I know. When he went through the hearing process to become a member of the D.C. Circuit Court about 12 years ago, I was able to ask him questions in a hearing. One of the answers that he gave me relative to his personal role in the question of detention and interrogation of suspected terrorists turned out to be in doubt after the hearing and after he ascended to the bench, to the point where I sent him a letter as a judge on the D.C. Circuit saying, please explain how you could tell us that you had nothing to do with detention and interrogation, and yet Vice President Cheney comes back and says that you were part of a very important meeting on the subject. Those two statements contradict one another. He never replied to my letter. That was 12 years ago. He'll get a chance to reply now because he'll be facing me under oath when he comes before the Senate Judiciary Committee. I might say that for those who are jumping to the conclusions that they're for or against him, I am not in that position. I have many questions to ask, and we are now assembling the evidence from his public service. Not just the 12 years on the D.C. Circuit, but the many years before it when he was part of the executive branch of our government. We estimate that there'll be up to 1 million documents produced. Put it in perspective. When Elena Kagan went through the same process and we asked on the Senate Judiciary Committee for the necessary documentation, they produced 170,000 documents. It takes a long time to go through them, and it'll take a long time to go through the Kavanaugh record before we can say that we've given it, due diligence that is required. It'll take some time, but we need to take the time. This is the swing vote on the Supreme Court for a generation or more, and we want to make certain that we know all that we can about this man, his background, his philosophy, and his values before there's a final vote in the United States Senate. The third point I want to raise is relative to immigration. I think there are some fundamentals and basics that every American would agree with, and here's what they are. America needs border security. Secondly, if there's someone dangerous who wants to come into our country, or someone dangerous here who doesn't have the legal right to be here, they should never be given the chance to be part of the United States, period. The third thing is we need comprehensive immigration reform. Our immigration system is a complete shambles at this point. We need bipartisan effort to do it, We put one together 5 years ago when I joined with the Republican senators, brought up comprehensive immigration reform, passed it in the Senate with 68 votes, and then at that time Speaker Boehner and the Republicans refused to even consider it. We still need that effort. But the last point I want to make after acknowledging those three is that what has happened with zero tolerance is shameful. It is disgraceful that the United States would forcibly separate up to 3,000 children from their parents. 3,000 kids taken away from their mothers and their fathers. And to add insult to this grievous injury, records were not kept of the parents and children. When you hear the lengths that our government is currently going to just to unify, under court order, to unify the children and the parents, it's evidence that there was little or no concern about that possibility when they separated the two earlier. I have seen many of these children when they were up in Chicago a few weeks ago. It breaks your heart to see a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old separated, and we know that it does damage to kids. The pediatricians tell us this is a form of child abuse. It's something the United States should never have been part of. The San Diego Federal Court is requiring this government to reunite all of these children with their parents by July 26. Mark my word, they can't do it. They can't physically do it. The 103 that they identified under the age of 5, only 56 of those were reunited. So clearly there's more work that needs to be done. But it is sad commentary on this administration's immigration policy that they took it out on the kids and their parents. That is below the dignity of the United States. Happy to answer any of your questions.
Senator, what do you anticipate, or conversely, what do you fear with President Trump one-on-one with Vladimir Putin with no one else in the room?
President Trump has well established his manner and approach when it comes to dealing with important issues. He refuses to read papers. He likes to have things explained to him. He is not only unprepared, many times he's unpredictable. He veers from one side of the track to the other and takes some great comfort in the fact that he catches everybody off guard, as he just recently did with NATO and did before with G7. And to think that he's going into a room with this former KGB agent is frightening to me. I don't believe the important issues of war and peace that face the United States and the world can be resolved with a president who doesn't take his job any more seriously.
Senator, in the wake of the indictment, should there be some kind of sanctions or punishment put in place against Russia?
The first thing that the president ought to say to Vladimir Putin is, we want you to extradite these accused Russian intelligence officers. Of course he'll refuse. But if the president doesn't start with that, you wonder, will Putin take him seriously? I mean, think of all the things that Putin has done over the years. And he now is in a position where this president seems to be his best buddy. I don't get it. I don't understand how we've reached this point with a nation which has such a sorry record when it comes to human rights and respecting the sovereignty of other nations.
Are you confident that Illinois' voting system is secure?
No. I received assurances from the election officials that they think that the raid hacking that occurred a few years ago won't occur again. I hope they're right. But we know that the Russians and others are working night and day to break into all systems. And so I can't say with any confidence that our election process is going to be intact and secure. And I don't believe we put enough resources as a nation into investigating what happened 2 years ago and making certain it never happens again.
Is Congress taking steps to correct that?
We are, but only small steps. The amount of money which we've turned loose nationwide is 10% of what we did even years ago, and it just doesn't reflect a serious undertaking to protect our system. I think we could do and should do a lot more, but there is denial by the Trump administration because they fear that any acknowledgement of Russian involvement somehow makes the case stronger against the president personally. I don't connect the two. Let's keep our election system intact and secure so that people have confidence in the outcome.
Do you support the president's call for more money for NATO and his push to have Germany quit buying and punish the Russians by quit buying natural gas from them?
Well, I certainly support the president's new military budget. I voted for it. I helped to write it. And it is the largest budget increase in the history of our country, short of actual World War II or Vietnam or something of that nature. So we are taking it seriously from our end. And when the president calls on other NATO allies to put more money into the process, yes, I support it. But they have been increasing their contribution over the years. This isn't something new to his administration. I do think that some of the divisive rhetoric that he used in Brussels didn't help to assure our allies that we're standing together as a team. Do you want to put this over here?
The president today referred to the European Union as a foe in terms of trade. What do you think that rhetoric does to our relationship with our allies?
The same thing it does to declare that we're in a trade war with Canada. For goodness sakes, you know, the president is looking for enemies, and he's pointing to our closest friends and doing it, and it makes no sense. Meanwhile, he overlooks what Putin is doing to the United States and to the world. I want to have good trade agreements because I believe the United States can compete on a global basis successfully. And I do believe that the Chinese and others in the past have really abused our trade agreements. We need to get tougher. There's no question about it. But his approach in going after Canada, for example, just doesn't make any sense to me. And to categorically dismiss the European Union, I don't think it's consistent with a trade policy that people can even understand, let alone support.
Are tariffs, though, just a hidden tax on the American consumer?
They turn out to be a tax because what happens, and I've heard this from our farmers and many others, is that it is more difficult for us to sell overseas, and the products coming into the United States are more expensive. It is like an added tax. Having said that, though, in some circumstances, they're necessary. I think in the steel situation, I wouldn't have done it as broadly as the president suggested, but it was clear that at least 3 countries have historically dumped steel in the United States, selling it here at lower than the cost of production in their own countries to run American steel producers out of business, and they've done it successfully. So you have to be able to respond quickly to stop that sort of thing, and occasionally tariffs are the only way to do it.
There's been some non-binding votes in the Senate on this tariff issue. Kind of what has been done. Can there anything substantially be done on this front?
There is in this respect. The president has wide latitude when he imposes a tariff for economic reasons. But what the administration is suggesting is that these tariffs are for national defense purposes. When he does that, I believe it really raises a second question. What does our trade with Canada have to do with national defense? That's a legitimate question. And so we passed, non-binding, but passed a resolution saying Congress should be consulted on that. It passed overwhelmingly. I think the president, like most others, will just ignore it.
So to be clear, you haven't taken an official position on the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh?
No, I have not.
Okay. What are you looking to hear from him that would...
A lot. You know, he has a lengthy record before he was on the D.C. Circuit Court and since. On major issues that will be decided by his swing vote if he goes to the Supreme Court. And so we have a lot of questions to ask. His position on many issues troubles me. But
What do you make of concern specifically about Roe v. Wade?
Well, Roe versus Wade, or a woman's right to have the freedom of making her own health care decisions and planning her family, I think has been fundamental in this country now for over 40 years under Roe. And I think it should continue and be respected as established law. I want to hear those words from Mr. Kavanaugh if he goes forward. I have serious questions as well of his position on the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act now is under siege by the Trump administration. 20 state attorneys general supported by President Trump are trying to basically end the Affordable Care Act. The way they're doing it is saying that you cannot say that people with pre-existing conditions or medical histories cannot be discriminated against when it comes to hospitalization premiums. That would be the end of the Affordable Care Act as we know it, and certainly is a question I would ask Kavanaugh.
Well, why go that route of taking time, as you say, as opposed to a couple of nominations ago where the response was, Merrick, what?
Yeah, well, that's the reality. Mitch McConnell, Republican leader of the Senate, changed the traditions and roles of the Senate. When there was a vacancy with Scalia's death in February, and President Obama proposed Merrick Garland, a widely respected jurist, Mitch McConnell said, I not only won't give him a hearing and a vote, I won't even meet with him. And the reasoning he used was, we've got an election coming up. Let the American people decide what the Senate will look like, what the White House will look like. Well, here we are again with an election coming up, and McConnell's decided to change the rules and say we need to move through this quickly. So I think it's pretty clear what he was setting out to do to make sure that there was a possibility, at least, of a Republican president filling that vacancy, which happened with Gorsuch.
Yeah, why not try to snuff out Kavanaugh right at the start?
Snuff him out?
Well, as those folks did with the Garland nomination.
No, that it doesn't work. When you're in the minority, he was in the majority when he made that decision. There's a 51-49 majority with McCain sick 50-49, but one vote's enough. This is a majority rule Senate at this point on the issue of Supreme Court. People have come up to me at parades and back home on the street and said, okay, now here's what you ought to do. Don't give them a quorum in the Senate Judiciary Committee. We explored it. That doesn't work. Don't give them a quorum on the floor. Explored that as well. It doesn't work. We are going to have a diligent process to make a decision on Kavanaugh, but the notion that we can somehow stop it indefinitely is not realistic.
Senator, when would you announce your intention about whether or not you would seek another term?
I'd at least wait until after this election before I would announce my plans for the next election.
Senator, what do you make of calls on the wake of several sexual harassment allegations for Speaker Madigan to resign as head of the party?
Well, what I did was to reach out to Speaker Madigan as chairman of the party when Tim Mapes resigned after some 30-plus years of service to him. And I suggested to the Speaker that for the good of the party, he ought to turn over the assignment of filling the executive director spot to the women of the party, the State Central Committee women. He agreed to do it. He added Juliana Stratton into the mix, our lieutenant governor candidate on the Democratic side. And I thought that was a step forward in the right direction and acknowledged the fact that this was a challenge to the integrity of our party and that he ought to make that kind of a historic move. He did it. He also has put together a panel which includes Susanna Mendoza, Tina Chen, Carol Ammons, and there's another, I think, Melinda Bush, which is trying to take up the larger issue of sexual harassment in the context of political campaigns where it's a special challenge. So I would say that he has been responsive at this point. In terms of his service as Speaker, that's a decision made by the members of the House. As a leader of the party and the role I deal with him the most, he has been responsive to my suggestions.
Your thoughts on the appointment of Christian Mitchell as interim executive director?
It was a surprise. 5 women sat down and picked a man. Nothing wrong with that at all. Certainly when you look at Christian Mitchell, he is an extraordinary person. I've come to know him and like him and believe he's part of a new generation of leadership in our state. I supported him twice when he had serious primary opposition in Chicago. He was successful in both cases. And we've talked since. He wants to do the job. He's an articulate spokesman for the party and kind of a surprise choice that the women would choose him, but I think a good one.
Senator, back to the Affordable Care Act. Administration recently blocked some of the funding that goes to insurance companies for their high-risk pools. Some people are saying that's going to drive up premiums. What should Illinoisans expect in the aftermath of that?
Well, I can tell you this administration, the Trump administration, has done everything it can to end the Affordable Care Act or to sabotage it, limiting the period of time when people could sign up for new coverage, limiting the number of people who were working with individuals to make sure they could navigate their way through the system. They've done everything they can to stop it or sabotage it. The net result of this will be higher hospitalization insurance premiums. Across this state and around the nation, this is the number one concern of people when they talk about health care. Can I buy it? Can I afford it? And will my family even be eligible if there's a pre-existing condition or medical history? And this administration has done everything it can to end the Affordable Care Act's preference to give everybody in the United States an opportunity for affordable health.
There are reports this week there could be an attempt to impeach Rod Rosenstein. Do you expect that to happen?
No, I don't see it. I can't keep up with the investigations of the House Republicans. You know, what did they take 10 or 12 hours the other day with the former FBI official? There'll be a lot of rumors flying. Rosenstein, I believe, has done a good job. I haven't agreed with everything he's done, but I think he's done a good job.
Have you met with I don't know if he's been confirmed yet, Andrew Wheeler, new acting administrator of EPA?
No, haven't yet.
Have you heard anything further on the possible pardon of former Governor Blagojevich?
Nothing. I have not written a letter to the president. All I have said publicly, and I stand by it, I thought 14 years was a sentence that was way too long. And I think people who are guilty of even more serious crimes are sentenced to shorter terms in prison. And that's the only response I've made. I've not made any recommendation to the president one way or the other.
Senator, yesterday
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Should Congress provide additional funds to help Illinois secure its election system?
We definitely need more resources in Illinois and across the nation to make sure that the Russians don't have a second try at jeopardizing and sabotaging our election. The amount of money that's been appropriated so far is small, and for our state won't have a measurable impact. I don't believe the Trump administration has taken the possibility of Russian infiltration seriously, and in fact the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Nielsen, said as of Saturday she didn't think there was any problem. I think she's wrong.
Should Congress or the administration try to develop some sort of fund to help out anybody in agriculture who's going to be impacted adversely by this trade war?
Well, I can tell you it's an interesting response when you talk to farmers about it. I had the soybean growers in last week, and you know, it's a slogan, but I think it's a true sentiment. They said, we don't want aid, we want trade. And this notion that there's going to be some sort of bailout if the trade war continues to see soybean corn prices plummet. I think they've gone down, according to the growers, about 20% so far, both of them. I think that's unlikely. It's possible, but unlikely. I just think when you look at it, it is not just this year. It's our reputation. Whether we can be counted on to enter into long-term agreements to sell grains like corn and soybeans in China and other countries. That's the problem with this kind of trade war.
Senator, isn't there legitimate arguments, though, that our European allies have been tapping a lot more tariffs on our products than we do to them? And why not use our tariffs? I think the president has said he doesn't want tariffs, he wants reciprocity. Is he right on that, or what was your approach?
The fundamental argument's correct. We need to have, arm's length transactions between countries to make sure that there's a fair trade arrangement on both sides and it's enforceable. The question is tactics. When you decide to have across the board trade war tactics going after steel and aluminum from sources all over the world, and when you expand the tariffs to a litany or a menu of items coming out of China and they answer in kind, it goes way beyond this arm's length transaction. It really becomes an all-out trade war, and you wonder at the end, are there any reasonable people willing to sit down and work out the very real differences that should be resolved? I worry about that. I think this is typical of this administration and not necessarily productive.
Let me ask you, so guys like Doug Schoen and Mark Penn, both Democrats, among those saying the Democratic Party has just drifted too far to the left. Yesterday, the California Democrats endorsed Dianne Feinstein's opponent. What are your thoughts on the direction of the Democratic Party?
I think the direction is centrist, to be honest with you. Within each party, Democrats and Republicans, there are people on the extreme position. It happens. We're going to have those on the left saying things I don't agree with, and those on the right in the Republican Party which the mainstream Republicans don't agree with. That's the nature of American politics. I think, by and large, when you look at our agenda and what we're trying to achieve as Democrats, it's a centrist agenda. For example, dealing with the spiraling prescription drug prices. That's something every family worries about, and we should too. Making sure that health insurance is affordable and accessible for every family in this country. That's something every American agrees with. Dealing with the student debt out there that is really handicapping millions of young students, graduates, and their families is another issue. Time and again, we've got to find ways to deal with the economic issues that Americans care about.
Well, Senator, with regard to the separation of families, if tomorrow morning we air your remarks on that, I'm going to get an email saying, well, the last two administrations did it, Obama did it, W did it, and besides, they're here illegally. What part of illegal don't you understand?
I think what you'll find if you look at the record fairly is that the separations have been minor and limited in previous administrations. This administration set out last year and announced this year something called zero tolerance. What it meant was if you presented yourself at the border, they charged you as a criminal. Misdemeanor, for sure, but a criminal. And it followed from that if you're a criminal, you can't keep a young child in your physical possession. So they separated up to 3,000 of them, and then compounded the tragedy of that family by refusing to keep records about where the children were being sent. When we asked them point blank, where are these kids and where are their parents, they said, and this was 2.5 weeks ago, well, we know where 10 of them are. 10 out of 3,000. And today, I don't think it's much better. The notion that we have another 2,500, 2,800, whatever it might be to go, is a sad commentary, and it goes way beyond anything ever done by a previous administration. And let me say a word about they came in illegal, we can treat them any way we want. America is better than that. Historically, we have opened our doors to those in refugee status. I mean, it has affected every single community in our state. Need I remind you that our current mayor in the city of Springfield, his father came to this country as a refugee, and I'm glad he did. The Langfelder family and Midge and Mayor Langfelder have made a great contribution to this city. It's an example of when we open our arms to people in desperate situations, they come here grateful and make a great contribution to our country.
Now, is your next door neighbor trying to send a message to the senior senator?
No, I don't think it's to, it's to everybody in the block, and I will just say this, they mean it when they put that sign there. The McDermott family, Dr. McDermott and his wife Annette, have adopted 2 children from Haiti. I helped them in that process, and both of the little girls are now in college. Young women are now in college, and they have proven what that sign says. They are a loving, caring couple, and I'm honored to count them as neighbors.
Senator, Quick Political Report recently moved Illinois 13 from likely Republican to lean Republican. As somebody who used to represent a lot of this area in the House, what will it take for Democrats to retake that seat?
Well, I can tell you this, Betsy Dirksen-Londrigan has run an excellent campaign. Her showing in the primary, where she carried every county in this district and was the overwhelming winner, is an indication that this first-time candidate is catching on. And I think this improvement in her status and possibility of her election is a reflection of a lot of hard work and the sentiment in this district that they want a congressman who is not just a loyalist to the president, but who really represents the district and is willing to disagree with the president. I had an unusual thing happen this week. On Tuesday of this week, I received an email from the incumbent congressman. It was an official email, and he asked one question of me. Or should you vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh as a member of the Supreme Court? That was the morning after the president made the announcement, and he sent this official email to me. It's kind of interesting because I don't think that Congressman Davis gets to vote on this issue. In fact, I'm certain he doesn't under the Constitution. But sending that out on an official basis, I think we all understand, is an effort to improve his political situation.
You sent the House version of the Farm Bill. What would you like to see them take out of what the Senate and Committee Chair Pat Roberts and Ranking Member Stabenow kind of put together there?
We put together a good bipartisan bill, and it passed with a big margin. I voted for it. I disagreed with a few sections, but that's understandable in a bill of that size and complexity. The House has been tied up in knots over work requirements for the SNAP or the food stamps program and a few other things. There are about 3 or 4 major issues. Pat Roberts, a Kansas Republican, came up to me on the floor and he said it's going to be a long conference. It doesn't have to be. It shouldn't be. If there's ever a time when the farmers across the United States need some assurance of what the policies are going to be, it's now. The uncertainty of prices and the trade war really have a lot of them worried, and rightly so. So let's get this farm bill done on a bipartisan basis as soon as possible.
Those soybean farmers that were in your office, were they generally optimistic about what's going on, or are they being pessimistic?
They're worried. The soybean farmers that came to see me are worried. As everybody knows, we're the largest soybean producing state in the nation. We depend on exports for the success of that program and for the profitability of those farmers. And they're worried about where this is going. To my earlier point, not so much how it affects this year's crop, but the long-term reputation of American farmers to be reliable producers and partners. They've worked generations to create the right impression that they can be counted on, and this kind of trade war doesn't help.
Sir, I think you probably answered this earlier, though, but you think are ready for the next 2020 election?
I don't think we're ready at this, in terms of the security of the election.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have doubts as to whether we're ready. I agree with Dan Coates, the head of the Director of National Intelligence. He believes the Russians are trying again to make a mess of our election, and I don't think this administration has taken it seriously.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Senator.
Okay, thanks.